Let's just jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a truly fascinating and honestly pretty sobering piece of history today, the architecture of a lie, unpacking Austria's victim myth. We're going to examine how an entire nation meticulously engineered a historical myth to, well, escape its own dark past. It's literally a masterclass in political narrative building, and we'll break down exactly how they pulled it off using the actual historical data and documents from the era.
For decades, this exact phrase was the absolute bedrock of an entire country's post-war identity. Austria, the Nazis' first victim. But think about that for a second. How exactly did a country with hundreds of thousands of willing Nazi Party members manage to convince the entire world, and, maybe more importantly, convince itself, that they were just innocent bystanders?
Section 1. Austria's Wartime Realities.
Right, so to understand the sheer scale of this deception, we really have to look at the genuine trauma the country faced and how its public posture drastically shifted over just a couple of decades. Back during World War I, between 1915 and 1917, Austro-Hungarian troops were locked in this grueling, defensive trench warfare on the Isonzo front against Italy. The mood in the empire was deeply pessimistic. They were outnumbered, fighting a brutal war of attrition. Then, fast forward through the collapse of the empire and a bitter Austrian civil war in the early 1930s, and the public posture shifts completely. By March 1938, rather than resisting an invasion, the vast majority of Austrians warmly welcomed the Anschluss, the ideological annexation by Nazi Germany. The Viennese famously greeted Hitler with massive cheering crowds.
And when you dig into the data, a stark, disturbing contrast emerges between that later victim myth and the actual historical footprint. Just look at these numbers. Despite making up a tiny fraction of the greater German population, just 8%, Austrians disproportionately staffed the absolute most brutal elements of the Third Reich. They made up 14% of SS soldiers and a staggering 40% of extermination camp staff. 40%! That's hugely disproportionate.
Then we have this number, 17%. So what does this actually mean? Well, this represents the 17% of all Austrian adults who were official members of the Nazi Party. That amounts to 700,000 people. And, if you include their family members, roughly a fourth of all Austrians were deeply intertwined with the whole Nazi Party apparatus.
The historical data makes it crystal clear. The atrocities on Austrian soil were heavily driven by local participation. Historians note that the pogroms during the 1938 Anschluss in places like Vienna and Innsbruck were organized by Austrians themselves, often actually exceeding the cruelty seen in Germany at the time. The human cost was just devastating. Over 125,000 Jews were forced to flee, and 65,000 were murdered, which wiped out a third of the population. This cruelty also targeted the most vulnerable, ending the lives of 18,000 mentally ill individuals at Hartheim Castle and nearly eliminating the Austrian Roma community entirely. So, with such a heavily documented record of willing participation, we have to ask, where did this victim narrative actually come from?
Section 2. The Moscow Declaration.
Interestingly enough, the concept of Austria as a victim didn't even start in Austria. It started with the Allies. The British initially drafted the Moscow Declaration in 1943 as a strategic propaganda tool. The goal was to destabilize the Reich from the inside by fomenting local resistance and eventually to build a post-war buffer state. But post-war Austrian politicians entirely repurposed this document. They weaponized the Allies' own words to claim total innocence and complete absolution of collective guilt.
The fine print of this declaration tells a really fascinating story. It explicitly stated, Austria, the first free country to fall a victim to Hitlerite aggression, shall be liberated. Okay, sounds good, but Stalin explicitly appended a strict clause at the very end, demanding that Austria take responsibility for participating in the war on the side of Hitlerite Germany. It was a crucial clause that Austrian leadership promptly and, quite conveniently, totally ignored once the war ended.
Section 3. Constructing the victim myth.
The construction of this national myth didn't happen by accident. It happened in very clear, calculated steps. Step 1. April 1945. A provisional government is formed. They quickly followed this up with Step 2, implementing the Occupations Doctrine, an official doctrine claiming the years 1938 to 1945 were simply a period of foreign occupation, effectively laying all blame for war crimes solely on Germany. And then, Step 3. To sell this to the victorious Allies, the Austrian Foreign Ministry published the Red-White-Red Book in 1946. It selectively compiled documents to falsely claim that 70% of Austrians felt a fanatic animosity against the Anschluss. These calculated political moves allowed previously bitter political rivals, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, to unite under this completely fabricated consensus of self-sacrificing statehood.
By 1949, this doctrine was perfected for the domestic audience. Just listen to this quote from Rosa Jochman, who was a prominent political ideologist at the time. "We all were the victims of fascism, a soldier who has come through the war, the population of the home front, and finally, we, unprotected victims of the SS." Now, by politically broadening the definition of a victim to include literally everyone, even the soldiers actively fighting for the Third Reich, the actual victims of the Holocaust were deliberately erased from the narrative. Because think about it, when everyone is a victim, nobody is a perpetrator.
Section 4. Rewriting the past.
Once the myth was established, it required constant maintenance. The Austrian state basically had to reshape its entire society and legal system to protect this fragile lie. Right after the war, between 1945 and 1948, there was an initial push for justice. People's courts were actively prosecuting former Nazis, but justice was rapidly dismantled. By 1948, mass amnesties began. Why? Well, federal politicians realized they desperately needed the voting bloc of 500,000 returning veterans and former party members who were suddenly deemed less tainted. This pursuit of electoral power effectively killed denazification, leading right up to the mid-1970s, where prosecutions of Nazis officially just stopped altogether.
The practical implementation of this myth in everyday Austrian life was, frankly, staggering. While Wehrmacht and SS veterans formed societies and literally paraded openly in uniform and erected memorials across rural towns, the true victims were erased. Anti-fascist monuments were hidden away or had their texts altered to avoid offending tourists and locals, and Jewish survivors were incredibly told to submit their restitution claims to Germany instead, as Austria claimed it simply didn't exist during the atrocities. To top it all off, school syllabuses were completely rewritten to enforce this victim identity onto the next generation. All of this diplomatic and internal maneuvering culminated in a 1955 Austrian state treaty. Austrian diplomats actually successfully convinced the Allies to strike any mention of Austrian war guilt from their sovereign founding treaty. Austria regained its independence, the occupying troops left, and the myth was fully legally enshrined. But, as we know, a lie of this magnitude, one that contradicts the lived reality of millions of people, cannot survive forever.
Section 5. The myth unravels.
The end of the 20th century finally brought a highly painful public reckoning. The cracks in the facade appeared slowly at first. In 1965, an anti-fascist named Ernst Kirchweger was killed during a demonstration, sparking rare political protests that forced the elite to distance themselves, just a little bit, from ultra-right factions. But old habits die hard, right? In 1975, Chancellor Bruno Kreisky controversially defended a political ally who was a former SS officer, insisting once again that all Austrians were victims. The true breaking point, however, arrived in 1986 with the Waldheim affair. Kurt Waldheim, a former Wehrmacht intelligence officer, ran for federal president. The international exposure of his past put Austria on the verge of total international isolation. It finally shattered the 40-year illusion, forcing a generational confrontation with the historical data we reviewed earlier. By 1988, the political administration, and eventually the wider public, finally admitted collective responsibility and officially abandoned the victim theory.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought. When a nation chooses to rewrite its history, who pays the price of that silence? Constructing a national myth might heal political divides in the short term, and yeah, it might even rebuild a fractured country, but it always comes at the devastating expense of truth, and it always abandons the true victims. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives and keep learning.